All right, so good afternoon, y'all. Thank you all for being here. My name is Dustin Fridkin. I'm a professor of political science here at Santa Fe College, and I'm here today to talk about the Astor Place riot, which was the sort of historical event that empowers a political scientist to come before a group of people and talk about Shakespeare. So just by way of introduction, on the evening of the 10th of May, 1849, there was a riot outside of the Astor Opera House in New York City. It left more than 20 people dead. The immediate cause of the riot centered around a disagreement among theater-goers over the proper way to perform Shakespeare. Some preferred the bombastic style of the American-born Edwin Forrest, perhaps America's most famous performer at the time, and others preferred the more sedate style, some might say dignified, of the English actor William Macready. What I want to talk about today is how and why exactly it is that 20-odd people managed to die over the question of how Shakespeare ought to be performed. So to set the stage here, I want to begin by reading a little bit from an account that was written by a guy named H.M. Ranney, who wrote up the incident for the United States District Court of the Southern District of New York. Right? So this is like the official government account here. It says, on the night, and I quote, on the night of the 10th of May, 1849, the Empire City, the great metropolis of the Union, was the scene of one of those horrors of civilization which for a time make the great heart of humanity stop its beatings. In the darkness of night, thousands of citizens were gathered in a central square of that most aristocratic quarter of New York, gathered around one of its most conspicuous and magnificent edifices, the Astor Place Opera House. This opera house was built expressly for the performance of Italian opera, but has been used at intervals for the legitimate drama, for vaudevilles, and for balls and concerts. It's fitted and decorated up with taste and magnificence, and in the opera seasons has been attended by the wealthy and fashionable people who have made extravagant displays of luxurious adornment. While the private boxes were taken by the season by those who wished to enjoy the music and liked the display and could afford the expenditure, the other seats were let at $1 admission, and the upper tier or amphitheater was reserved for people of more modest pretensions at 25 cents a ticket. So this sets a scene, I think. This is what theater looked like in the United States back during the first half of the 19th century. Some theaters, like the Astor Place Opera House, were fancy, and others, like the Bowery Theater a few blocks away, also in New York, in a less aristocratic neighborhood, also offered the same basic list of seatings, right? We had box seats for those who can afford them, while reserving more space for what we might call the general admission crowd. People of various socioeconomic standing saw the same plays in different theaters, but not from the same vantage point. During the first half of the 19th century, theaters in the United States usually followed what is called a tripartite seating arrangement, with the boxes, the pit, and the gallery. The wealthy and respectable people sat in the boxes. People of middling sorts sat in the pit, and those of the lower orders watched from the gallery. Walt Whitman, who was a newspaperman at the time of the Astor Riot, he remembered his experience of theater-going in New York as providing the opportunity to look up into the first row of boxes and see the leading authors in the city while rubbing elbows in the cheap seats with omnibus drivers, cobblers, shipwrights, and carpenters. In these theaters, as was mentioned, vaudeville, blackface minstrelsy, and Shakespeare were all part of the offerings, often on the same ticket. Shakespeare was a central part of a vibrant and diverse pop culture in the United States. To put this more emphatically, during the first half of the 19th century, Shakespeare's works were not presented to mass audiences in hopes of elevating those audiences. They were presented to mass audiences because mass audiences wanted Shakespeare. As Noah Belatsky put it in a 2014 article for the Pacific Standard, folks in the mid-1800s didn't read young adult fiction or deface their brains with the Avengers or 50 Shades of Grey. Instead, they read, wrote, and even memorized The Bard. Right? This is a time when Shakespeare is pop culture. So I want to return now briefly to Ranney to talk about the riot. So around the edifice of the Astor Place Opera House, a vast crowd gathered. On the stage, the Edinburgh actor Macready was trying to act out the part of Macbeth in which he was interrupted by hissing and hooting, and encouraged by the cheers of an audience who had crowded the house to sustain him. Now, this was actually pretty standard operating procedure in the American theater. When people liked what they heard, they cheered, and when they didn't, they booed and hissed, and hoped to boo and hiss loud enough to cause the performer to leave the stage. On the outside, there was a mob gathering trying to force entrance into the house and throwing volleys of stone at the barricaded windows, while inside the house, police were arresting those who were making the disturbance. In the midst of the scene of clamor and outrage was heard a clatter of troop approaching the scene. The military are coming," was the exclamation of the crowd. So, in order to try to break up this riot, the militia is called in, because the police force can't do it. At last the awful word was given to fire. There was a gleam of sulphurous light, a sharp, quick rattle, and here and there in the crowd a man sank upon the pavement with a deep groan or death rattle. So here we are, chaos inside the theater, chaos outside the theater, the militia firing on protesters, and at least 20 people dead in the streets of New York, shot and killed by militia from the state's 7th Regiment. At least 30 more were maimed. So why? At a basic level, the conflict here was over aesthetics. How ought Shakespeare be performed? And the answer to this question fell along class lines in the state of New York. That is to say, along lines of socioeconomic class. The middling sort of people who sat in the pit, as well as the working class sort who sat in the gallery, preferred the bombastic style of the American Edwin Forrest, while the well-heeled folks in the boxes preferred the more dignified Englishman, William Macready. Now, there had been a conflict simmering between these two performers for years. Forrest blamed Macready for spoiling his reception in London when he went over to England to perform. Macready deeply resented Forrest for having booed and hissed at him during a performance of Hamlet. Forrest, for his part, explained his behavior by insisting that Macready had introduced an effete little dance to a soliloquy in such a way as to undermine the integrity of the role he was playing. The two had held competing performances in cities all over the United States, and so it was neither surprising nor out of character for Forrest to be performing Macbeth at the Bowery Theater at around the same time as Macready was performing over at the Astor. What was surprising was the way in which the conflict between them came to such a violent boil that night. So part of what was going on here is just good old-fashioned American jingoism, right? The folks who rioted outside of the Astor Opera House were essentially protesting the fact that Macready was performing there rather than Forrest, right? Performing there in the English style rather than the American style. Right? Forrest, after all, was the first famous Shakespearean actor the United States had ever produced, and Macready was just another fussy old Englishman. But there was more than national pride here on the line. Right? And here's where we get political, right? You need to keep in mind that 1849 was a difficult time politically in New York. Many in the city and the state had recently backed what was called the Free Soil Party, and that party's result from the Democratic Party, over the issue of slavery in the United States. Right? Many spent the year of 1848 eagerly watching news out of Europe, out of places like France and Ireland, hoping that what they saw happening over there was part of a transnational movement towards democratic republicanism, towards liberty and freedom. By 1849, of course, the Free Soil Party had been crushed in the November election. The revolutions of 1848 had been crushed. And of course, the aristocratic-leaning Whig Party had won control over both the presidency of the United States and the mayorship of the city of New York. It was a tough time for working people in New York. Right? They had the lovely memory of the bold feelings of 1848, of which, to quote Whitman again, Whitman wrote of that time, "God, 'twas delicious, that brief, tight, glorious grip upon the throat of kings." And that glorious feeling and the memory of it made the bitterness of 1849 all that much worse. The strongly pro-democracy forces within New York City, which were particularly potent in and among the working people of the city, were frustrated and worried that they were on the road to permanent defeat. That they, like the revolutionaries of France and Ireland and elsewhere, were to be yoked under the despotic rule of the rich. And we can see this if we take a look at the people who participated in the riot, if the 86 men there who were arrested were at all typical, the crowd had been composed of workingmen coopers, printers, butchers, carpenters, servants, salesmakers, machinists, clerks, masons, bakers, plumbers, laborers, that is to say, whose feelings were probably reflected in a speech that was given at a rally the next day. And I quote, "Fellow citizens, for whom was this murder committed? To please the aristocracy of the city, at the expense of the lives of unoffending citizens, to revenge the aristocrats of this city against the working classes." Although such observers as the New York Tribune saw the riot as absurd and incredible, the result of a petty quarrel, the role of class was not ignored. A home journal viewed the riot as a protest against the aristocratizing of the pit, right, which had previously been the place where middling sorts of people went to watch the theater. In such new and exclusive theaters as the Astor Place Opera House. And they warned that in the future, the Republic's rich would have to be mindful where its luxuries offend. The New York Herald asserted that the riot had introduced a new aspect in the minds of the many, nothing short of controversy and collusion between those that have been styled the exclusives, or the upper 10, on the one hand, and the great popular masses on the other. The New York correspondent for the Philadelphia Public Ledger lamented a few days after the riot that it leaves behind a feeling to which this community has hitherto been a stranger, an opposition of classes, the rich and the poor, a feeling that there is now in our country and in New York City what every good patriot has hitherto considered it his duty to deny, a high and a low class. This realization that there was a developing distinction between high class and low class New Yorkers, between high and low class Americans, was a primary cause of the riot. And the hardening of this distinction was the primary consequence of the riot. Well, the primary consequence of the riot, unless you count those people who were killed or maimed. Right? The primary consequence here was, as historian Lawrence Levine puts it, the emergence of cultural hierarchy in the United States. Right? As Ranney, again, the one who was writing for the court, put it, the question became not only a national but a social one. It was a question of the rich against the poor, the aristocracy against the people, and this hatred of wealth and privilege, which is increasing all over the world and ready to burst out whenever there's the slightest of occasion. The rich and well-bred are too apt to despise the poor and the ignorant, and they must not think it strange if they are hated in return. So after the riot, the Astor Opera House limped along for a couple of years before it closed, unable to perfume over the smell of blood that clung to the place. But that wasn't the end of elite aristocratic theaters in New York, far from it. But what they did was, instead of rebuilding a new opera house downtown where the Astor had been, they moved uptown to get further away from the rabble, right? Further away from the people who would have sat in the pits and the galleries. They opened up what was called the New York Academy of Music, right? Way uptown, right? They opened it without the cheap seats, right? And it's from this growing separation between wealthy theater-goers and poorer theater-goers that we get the emergence of highbrow culture on the one hand, as the culture that is consumed by the wealthy at the fancy theaters, and lowbrow culture, right, as the stuff that is consumed by, poor schmucks like you and me, right, at the cheap theaters. And with that, I would like to see if you all have any questions for me.
So where exactly was the Astor?
The Astor, so it's it's literally at Astor Place, right? So downtown New York on the east side, right, of Manhattan. Right? Yeah, towards the Lower East Side. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I don't
So the theater building was still there until the early 1900s, when it was torn down and replaced by, I believe, an 11-story tall office building. Yes. Yes.
So since now there wasn't a gallery or pit, did the price go up when they built the new theater? So
yeah, so when they
people and the prices went up as well?
Yeah, so right, previously, so the Bowery Theater and the Astor Place Theater were both very near each other, right, in downtown New York City. When they moved uptown, Bowery Theater stayed put, right, stayed where it was and kept the same structure that it had always had, right? Boxes, gallery, pit, right? The Academy of Music, right, did not have gallery seats. There was no place to, no seat that you could buy for a quarter, right? All of the seats that they had were expensive. And they essentially operated with boxes and a pit, but no gallery. Right? Again, with the express, I think I skipped over a little bit of what the riot within the theater actually looked like, because the folks in the gallery in the Astor Place Theater began booing and hissing at William Macready as he performed. When boos and hisses were insufficient to get him off the stage, they began throwing things like rotten eggs, right, and bags of garbage and things, right? And when that failed, they started throwing the seats, right, off of the gallery and down towards the boxes and the pit, right? Which is the sort of thing that the well-heeled folks decided they wanted to avoid in the future, right? Yes?
So when you were researching and getting as much knowledge as possible about Astor Place and the riot, what did you find the most interesting and the thing that shocked you the most?
The thing that really surprised me the most was what a commonplace thing it was for audiences and performers to interact over the course of a performance. Right? It was really very much expected that there was a sort of two-way communication between performers and audience, right? And that audiences were not expected to just sort of calmly and politely wait until the end to either applaud or not, right? It was just a matter of course. It was expected that if the audience stopped liking what they were seeing, that they would boo and hiss and maybe even throw things, right? And it was this kind of interaction that was thought to thought to work both ways in sort of establishing sort of democratic control over what was performed. Right? Does that make sense? I think that was the most interesting thing, and maybe the most interesting consequence also of the separation, right? The physical separation of high culture and low culture, right? Because that separation effectively ended what had been previously a conversation. Yes?
So is this stratification that happens in these artistic or entertainment worlds, does that repeat in history at all?
Yeah, so that's a good question too. I mean, I think that there are probably people here in this room who are better qualified than I am to answer that question. But yes, I think that the stratification, right, cultural stratification and political stratification have tended to go hand in hand. Right? Economic stratification, political stratification, cultural stratification, right? All of these things, right? It's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship, but they do tend to go together, right? I mean, one place where you can see this kind of thing, and this might be sort of a silly example, but everybody, y'all aware of the year 1066? Why the year 1066 is a big deal for people who speak English?
Yeah.
It's when the Normans invaded England from France. Right? And what happened when the Normans invaded England from France is that French became the language of the nobility and the royalty, whereas Old English became the language of the peasants. The peasants would be the ones, for example, who would be taking care of the farms, and the nobility and the aristocracy would be the ones eating the results of what was created in the farms. Right? So the peasants raised things like pigs and cows. Right, and pigs and cows and sheep, whereas the elites ate pork and beef and mutton. Right, pork, beef, and mutton are all words that are derived from the Norman French. right? Whereas cow, pig, sheep, those all come from the Old English. And you'll notice that when you go to a nice restaurant, right, even today, right, the chances are good that what it's going to offer you is not cow or pig, right? It's going to offer you beef or pork, right? So, or if it happens to be a particularly fancy place, they might have venison on the menu, right? They'll call it venison rather than dead deer. Right, so I think that this is an example, right, of the way cultural stratification happens and the way it tracks along political and economic lines as well. Right, so I would think that yes, this is the sort of thing that repeats itself through history. Yes.
Did the members of militia decide on their own to fire, or were they given an order to fire?
They were given orders to fire. So the militia was had been kept on hand because essentially everybody knew that the situation that was brewing in and around the Astor Opera House was something of a powder keg, right? Just waiting for a spark. And there had been, ongoing antagonism between Forrest and his backers on the one hand, Macready and his backers on the other. And the police had already announced to the people who ran the Opera House that they were not confident in their ability to control the crowd. So that's why the militia was on hand.
And isn't militia like the National Guard?
The militia has morphed into the National Guard, yes. But at the time, they were still just militia.
Do you know the name of the person who gave the order to fire?
I do not know the name of the person who gave the order to fire, but I do know that it was the New York 7th Militia.
On a similar note, somebody outside wants to know, is this the same as the riots depicted in Gangs of New York?
No, it's not the same as the riots depicted in Gangs of New York, though it is around the same basic time period, though the Gangs of New York riots are about 11 years later, right, 11, 12, some odd years later, during the Civil War. Right, the big riot at the end of Gangs of New York is, I believe, the draft riot, the New York draft riot, that ended up being put down by the United States military. But the riot, most of the gang fighting that they show there is between folks that consider themselves nativists, right, Native Americans. That is to say, when I say Native American in this context, what I mean is people who came from good old solid Anglo-Saxon Protestant stock. Right, who might be descended to the people who founded Massachusetts or founded New York or what have you. They held themselves in distinction from more recent immigrants from places like Ireland. Right, so rioting, the culture of rioting in the streets was definitely a part of life in New York at this time. Yeah. Yes.
So nowadays, what is the where it was, how gentrified is that area now?
That's a great question. Quite. Right. I mean,
because there's a Starbucks there. I looked on Google Maps just now.
Oh, really? Yeah, for sure. Of course, there's a Starbucks there. Yeah. I mean, if I'm remembering exactly, if I'm remembering my geography correctly, the Astor Place is down towards the East Village / Lower East Side part of New York, which is quite gentrified, right? So used to be kind of a down in the heels sort of neighborhood. Nowadays, I believe it is inhabited primarily by tech bros. Right.
This would be somewhat related. What is the importance of Astor Place? And I'm assuming they're asking about Astor.
Oh, Astor, the millionaire. Right, the Astor family. The Astor family is a wealthy family from New York. Their wealth comes mainly from furs, if I recall correct. Yeah, so that is the significance of Astor.
And this is where it takes place, is on that
Right, there at Astor Place.
circle? Or
Yes, in that circle, that's right.
circle or
Yeah,
square?
yeah, right, in that circle or square. I should have looked up the geography, but didn't. Because I'm a political scientist, not a geographer.
Somebody else has another question from
Sure.
outside. The interaction between actors and audience resembles the Globe Theater. The recreation of the Globe includes places for groundlings now.
Mm-hmm.
So the American 19th century audience offers similar options.
Okay.
I'm guessing.
That sounds right. I guess I don't know all that much about audience performer interactions during Shakespeare's day.
Well, I'll to throw it in. It was very similar. Groundlings would, however, be in what you're saying is the pit. So they would be right up there in front, whereas the royalty would be more in the gallery area.
Okay.
Which means they wouldn't have had access to chairs to throw.
Right.
I find that interesting that they are above and able to.
Yeah, right. It is.
Project
It sounds like kind of a design flaw, right? It's you put the rowdy people up top where you can't see them and they can rain things down upon your head. Maybe not the best idea. Probably better to keep them in the pit.
I have another question from the hall. Little hall. By the way, Carolyn says that. Would you attribute the rise of Shakespeare from pop culture to Hollywood culture to this riot? Or were there contributing factors?
Yeah, so I think it's clear that the riot is not like the sole cause here. I think it's more symptomatic of the riot. I think happened when it did because of people's growing awareness of what was already a growing divide. Right? And places like the Astor Place Opera House were symbolic of this growing divide. Because it's a much fancier theater than the ones that came before it, though not as fancy as the ones that came after it. Right? So no, I mean I think that this is just a mile marker along what is a longer road, right? Though in many people this came to well, all this sound and fury came to signify this broadening gap between elite culture and mass culture.
Nice integration of the Macbeth.
Yes, thank you. You're welcome. You're quite welcome. I don't know if I gave it quite an adequate stentorian tone to it, but I'll give it my best.
Could you, from a political point of view, see a similarity with current culture and stratification and pop culture and politics?
Sure. We live in the golden age of the superhero movie, right? Y'all have probably noticed that. I wonder why. I think there is some politics to it. And I think that the politics to the people's enthusiasm for the superhero movie comes from an impression that a lot of people seem to have that there's something going wrong with the world that we inhabit currently. And I think that we really are hopeful that somewhere out there, there's some team of heroes that's going to come and rescue us. Right? So, I mean, I think that there is something indicative of our cultural moment, of our political moment, that is expressed in our culture. Where that fits in with highbrow, lowbrow, well, I don't know. One way it fits in with highbrow, lowbrow is that I am a professor of political science, and I don't watch those movies. Which means that I've essentially, I've removed myself from the broader cultural conversation. Right? As I think tends to happen with those of us who are excessively educated. Right? I don't know. Does that answer your question?
It gets at it.
Gets at it. Yeah.
Would it be reflected in our politics then as well?
Would it be reflected in our politics?
Do you see there's a cultural divide in the politics that matches a class divide and a cultural divide?
Well, I think a lot of people woke up on Wednesday morning after the election in 2016 and were awfully surprised that President Trump had become president, right, or had won the presidency. Yes? People recall that as having been a surprising moment, or many of us at least? Yeah. So I think that one of the reasons for that is that members of our elite culture, particularly members of our media elite culture, live in a world where there's just no way at all for Donald Trump to be an acceptable person or an acceptable candidate for president. Right? And they were just blown away. Right? Blown away, astounded that he had won. Right? Whereas, if you were actually paying attention to what people seemed to be saying when they got to go vote, right, you would note that there are a lot of people that like Donald Trump. in spite or even because elites find him unacceptable. So I do think, yes, right, there are definitely some ways in which this is reflected in our politics, right? I mean, I think another, to go back to the superhero metaphor, I think that for a lot of the people who had not come to grips with the fact that President Trump has strong support from a significant percentage of our nation's population, right? People who can't come to grips with that have spent the last 2 years breathlessly watching the Mueller report, right? Breathlessly watching the Mueller investigation because they were certain, right, that at the conclusion of the report, Robert Mueller would ride in on a white steed, right, and remove Donald Trump from the White House and restore us to national sanity. Right, because they still haven't come to grips with the divide between their perception of reality and the perception of many millions of their countrymen. Right, so yes, I mean, I think that this is the way culture divides us, right, I think is still important. And I think that the fact that, you know, we consume different cultures depending on our own sense of our identity or our own level of education or our level of wealth, right, I think that those things actually are politically problematic. Yes?
So we know at the time that this was considered a riot, but do you think this would be considered one of the first acts of terrorism? Because they didn't really have the technology that we have today, and we know the acts of terrorism have advanced because of our technology.
Right. No, I think that this is much more classically what we would consider a riot, right? Just an outpouring of anger that gains expression on the street, right? It was not so much. I mean, you know, the dying part, right? The part where people died, that happened in response to the riot, right? So the riot wasn't out there trying to kill people to make a political point. Right? It's just that the police all of a sudden responded to the riot with deadly force. Or police, militia, excuse me. That's a fair question, though. Yes?
So everybody that died in the riot, that was due to the militia?
Yes. Everybody killed in the riot was killed by the militia, to the best of my knowledge.
And so did it simply start by somebody saying, we don't like this actor, but we're still going to go and watch it and stir up trouble? Or was it they went in and realized who was acting and then they...
Yeah, so people who were supporters of Edwin Forrest bought up tickets in the gallery and in the pit, right, in order to get Forrest guys in there, right, to boo and hiss. And hopefully to boo and hiss louder than the people in the boxes clapped, right? Because here we are having a contest, right? Which was a totally, you know, a fairly normal contest until the chairs started raining down. Yes?
So, you know, Springs talked about the segmented city. So this is really what we're seeing, right? I mean, the Bowery continues to sort of drift down.
Yeah.
And it becomes much like the environs of the globe on the wrong side of the river until, you know, by the, I don't know, by the 50s, the Bowery is just a byword for, you know, the bottom.
Yeah, that's right.
And
yeah.
then we move uptown, build the New York Academy, which is where the rich people are moving uptown too. So it's almost like the sort that we see taking place really all over the world these days.
It's very much like that, absolutely. Yes, it is very much like that, right? This cultural isolation from each other is also expressed as a geographical isolation from each other, absolutely. And of course, political isolation from one another. Which is, by the way, that kind of isolation from each other is really perfect. A perfect set of ingredients for building a democratic political process, right? Maybe not. What else? Yes?
Considering the fact that 20 people died in this riot, what do you think like today, that if this happened today, what do you think the aftermath would be?
Well, gosh, you know, I mean, if we were talking in terms of, you know, proportionality, I'm not sure exactly what the population of New York City was in 1849. The numbers from the newspaper reports at the time have the writers in the vicinity of 10,000 people. I suspect that the city has at least increased in population by at least a factor of 10. You know, so if then the numbers of rioters would be 100,000, and the number of dead would be at least 200, or maybe 2,000. That would be. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, I think it would be. There's a technical term that we use in the business, bad. Right? Yeah, I think it would be bad. Or another word, interesting. It would be interesting. That's a good question. What else? Yes?
Do you know which side had more deaths?
Which side had more deaths?
And were they was there like a more of a backlash because of it?
So the people who died, right? The people who died were almost all of them working class people who were there at the protest, right? To the best of my knowledge, 100% of the people who died were working class protesters. Mostly men, a couple of women. So the other side, the other side's death count was 0. Yeah. Yes.
Do you know anything about the play that night? Like, what part they at, what scene? Or?
I don't know. I don't know which what scene they were at. I suspect that this all began relatively early, so I presume somewhere in Act 1, right? When is Macbeth's first soliloquy? I would suspect that's when it started.
Well, it would have probably been in Act 2,
Okay.
really, where he fully would come out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that would be my best guess. Yes.
Were there any people who like blame this riot on the quote unquote curse of Macbeth?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, that is not something that I encountered. Though I also suspect that it didn't hurt the notion of a curse. Right? Yeah. The newspaper accounts mostly blamed the protesters, mostly blamed the rioters, right? Although some of them took note of the fact that, you know, performers getting booed off the stage was a normal thing that happened at the theater, right? And so it was sort of abnormal for this performer to be backed by the guns of the police and the militia. So some people also blamed, right, in addition to blaming the rioters, some folks blamed the theater's owners, some folks blamed the performers, some folks blamed the police and the militia. And some folks just blamed everybody, right? Because why not?
Police would have been a fairly new organization.
Police were a fairly new organization, that's right.
Maybe a dozen years or
Something like that, yeah. Yeah, they were fairly new, and they were fairly sympathetic to the rioters.
The writers, yeah,
Yeah.
that's who they would have been. They would have been
Mhm.
those guys.
Yeah, drawn from the ranks of the working classes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Indeed.
The militia play the role of the mounted yeomanry.
Yeah, essentially. And they actually did at first march in on horseback.
Yeah.
They were turned back by a hail of stones, and so dismounted and came in as infantry wielding bayonets. And they didn't start firing until those bayonets started being wrenched out of their hands by the mob. Anyhow.
It's a good riot, man.
It is a good riot, right? It's nice to know about these things from time to time. And, you know, and it's also important to note that we are not the first people to live through acrimonious and difficult political times. Wouldn't it be interesting if people started throwing rocks at the screen when you go to the movie theater?
Or your professors.
What's that? Or your professors, yeah, my goodness. I'm very glad that the tradition of booing and hissing the performer is gone because I think it would make my days very difficult. Yes?
I've actually seen an opening act at a concert been booed off stage before.
Really?
Yeah.
That is interesting. The opening act of a concert booed off stage. Yeah, I've never seen that. That's a good, which concert was it?
It was at a Fall Out Boy concert. I don't remember who the opening act was, but
Yeah, well, whoever they was,
bad.
they were disappointed. Yeah. Who else? Questions or comments? Nope. Deers and headlights? Well,
Yeah.
Thanks. No, thank you all for having me. Thanks to the Media Center for setting this all up. Thanks to those of you in the gallery out there in the hallway. Right.